"You're just a glorified government employee," my sister sneered, adjusting her silk eye mask as we cruised at 30,000 feet. She thought my military uniform was a desperate plea for attention. She had no idea the two stealth F-22 Raptors suddenly flanking our commercial jet were there entirely for me. The air in the first-class cabin of United Flight 83 to Honolulu smelled faintly of roasted nuts and expensive perfume, a stark contrast to the jet fuel and ozone scent I was accustomed to. I sat in seat 2B, my dress blues pressed to regulations, staring out the window at the endless expanse of the Pacific Ocean. "Couldn't you have changed into normal clothes in the lounge?" My older sister, Leora, sighed from seat 2A. She took a delicate sip of her pre-flight mimosa, looking at me with that familiar mixture of pity and secondhand embarrassment. "It's a family vacation, Celine, not a recruitment drive at a strip mall. You look like you're about to ask the flight attendant for a military discount on the Wi-Fi." I kept my eyes on the horizon, my jaw tightening just a fraction. "I have to report directly to Joint Base Pearl Harbor Hickam the second we land, Leora. I don't have time to play dress-up in the bathroom." "Right, important government business," she said, her voice dripping with enough sarcasm to strip the paint off a bulkhead. She turned to the businessman across the aisle, flashing him a brilliant, perfectly veneered smile. "She's in the Air Force. Does paperwork, mostly. I keep telling her that at 28, she should be building equity in a real career, not playing soldier for 60 grand a year." I didn't correct her. I never did. For the last 6 years, while Leora was climbing the corporate ladder at a boutique PR firm in Chicago and marrying a wealthy tech executive named Greg, I was learning how to pull 9 Gs in a multi-million-dollar fighter jet. She thought my life consisted of stamping forms in a windowless room and occasionally doing jumping jacks at dawn. She didn't know about the deployments to Al Udeid. She didn't know about the classified sorties over hostile airspace in the dead of night. And she definitely didn't know about the events of the past 72 hours. Just 3 days ago, I had been in a debriefing room at Langley Air Force Base, staring down at my hands as they shook with adrenaline. My wingman, Captain David O'Connor, and I had been flying a routine patrol near an Allied border when a covert extraction team on the ground was ambushed. Communication was jammed. They were minutes away from being overrun by a heavily armed insurgent force. I made the call to break formation, dive below the radar deck, and provide close air support. My aircraft, an F-22 Raptor, the most advanced air superiority fighter on the planet, wasn't primarily designed for ground attacks in heavily populated valleys. But the men on the ground, a team of Navy SEALs who had been betrayed by an informant, didn't have time for me to worry about operational doctrines. I pushed the Raptor to its absolute physical limits, threading a needle of hostile anti-aircraft fire to deliver a payload with pinpoint accuracy, mere yards from the pinned-down Americans. We got them out, all 12 of them, but my jet had taken a glancing hit from shrapnel to the right vertical stabilizer. I had limped back to base on a prayer and fumes, landing completely dark. The Pentagon had immediately clamped down on the incident. It was classified top secret. I was ordered to take an immediate mandatory leave to let the political heat die down, and conveniently, my parents' 40th wedding anniversary in Hawaii was the perfect cover. My commanding officer, Colonel Mitchell, had handed me my commercial ticket with a tight, proud smile. "Get out of here, Captain Jenkins. And keep your mouth shut. We'll handle the brass." So here I was, sitting next to my sister, who had insisted on using Greg's frequent flyer miles to upgrade my seat, because she couldn't bear the thought of walking past me in coach. "You know," Leora continued, oblivious to my silence, "Greg's firm is hiring project managers. You're organized, right? I mean, the military must teach you how to file things alphabetically." I could put in a good word. You wouldn't have to wear that stiff collar anymore. You could actually buy a nice house instead of living in, what do you call them, barracks? "Base housing, Leora," I replied evenly, "and I like my job." "Oh, please," she scoffed, pulling her cashmere blanket up to her chin. "You're not special, Celine. You're a cog in a massive bureaucratic machine. You take orders, you fill out spreadsheets, and you pretend it's a patriotic duty. Meanwhile, people in the real world are innovating. We're actually making an impact." I took a slow, deep breath, letting the familiar mantra of my training wash over me. Control the controllable. I couldn't control my sister's raging narcissism or her utter ignorance. I could only control my reaction. "I'll think about it," I lied, leaning my head back against the headrest and closing my eyes. "You do that," she murmured smugly. "Wake me up when they serve lunch. And try not to look so rigid. You're making the other passengers nervous." I tuned her out, letting the low hum of the Boeing 777's engines lull me into a light doze. For the first time in nearly a week, my muscles began to untie their knots. The mission was over. O'Connor was safe. The SEALs were back on American soil. I just had to survive a week of Leora's relentless condescension. And then I could go back to the sky, where the rules made sense and the silence was pure. But the sky, as I was about to be reminded, is a highly unpredictable place. 2 hours into the flight, somewhere over the vast, empty blue of the Pacific Ocean, the tranquility of the cabin was shattered. It started with a subtle shift in the aircraft's pitch. To the untrained passenger, it felt like mild turbulence. But my internal gyroscope, honed by thousands of hours in the cockpit, immediately registered the change. We were banking left, dropping altitude slightly, and the engines were throttling back. It wasn't a weather maneuver. It was a holding pattern adjustment. A sharp ding echoed through the cabin as the seatbelt sign illuminated in glowing red. Leora groaned, pulling her eye mask up to her forehead. "Are you kidding me? The Wi-Fi just cut out? And now this?" I was right in the middle of uploading a reel. "Put your seatbelt on, Leora," I said quietly, sitting up straight. "It's just a little bumpy, Celine. Don't go into drill sergeant mode," she snapped, but she clicked the buckle anyway. Then the captain's voice crackled over the PA system. Usually, commercial pilots sound like they're narrating an audiobook, calm, slow, and borderline bored. But Captain Miller's voice had a tight, clipped edge to it. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the flight deck. We've been instructed by air traffic control to maintain our current altitude and heading. You may notice some military aircraft in our vicinity. Please remain calm and keep your seatbelts fastened. There is no cause for alarm." The cabin instantly erupted into a low murmur of anxious whispers. The businessman across the aisle paused his movie, his face paling. "Military aircraft?" Leora repeated, her voice pitching up in irritation. "What does that mean? Are they doing a drill? Because they shouldn't be allowed to do drills near commercial flights. I'm going to write a furious email to the airline." I didn't answer her. I was already leaning forward, my face pressed close to the thick acrylic window. The sky outside was a brilliant, blinding blue, dotted with wispy cirrus clouds. At first, I saw nothing, just the wing of our 777 slicing through the air. Then, a shadow detached itself from the glare of the sun. My breath caught in my throat. Moving with lethal, predatory grace, a sleek gray silhouette drifted into view. The unmistakable twin-tail fins, the diamond-shaped wings, the stealth coating that absorbed the sunlight rather than reflecting it. It was an F-22 Raptor. The fighter jet pulled up alongside our left wing, matching our speed perfectly. To the civilian eye, it looked terrifyingly close, maybe 50 feet away. To me, it was a textbook intercept formation. "Oh my God," the businessman gasped, pointing out the window. Look out there!" Passengers on the left side of the plane began to panic. Some unbuckled their seatbelts, standing up to get a better look, while others shrank back into their seats in terror. A flight attendant named Brenda rushed down the aisle, her face pale, waving her hands. "Please, everyone, remain seated. The captain said there's no cause for alarm." Leora leaned over me to look out the window. When she saw the fighter jet, her smug facade completely crumbled. The color drained from her face, leaving her spray tan looking sickly and yellow. "Celine," she whispered, her fingers digging into my forearm like talons. "Celine, what is that? Why is it so close?" "It's an F-22, I said, my voice steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs. "Are we being hijacked? Are they going to shoot us down?" Panic was rising in her throat, her voice cracking. "I knew it. I knew something was wrong at the airport. Celine, do something." I thought I just filed paperwork, Leora, I muttered, my eyes locked on the fighter. This isn't the time to be a bitch, she shrieked. Tell me what's happening. I don't know, I said, and for a moment, that was the truth. Standard operating procedure dictates that fighter escorts are only scrambled for extreme emergencies, a hijacked airliner, a loss of cabin pressure with an unresponsive crew, or an unauthorized entry into restricted airspace. But we weren't near any restricted airspace out here, and the plane was flying normally. Then, a second shadow fell over the cabin. I leaned closer to the glass and looked up. A second F-22 dropped from the clouds, taking position on the right side of the Boeing. 2 Raptors, a full combat element. My eyes scanned the nearest jet, reading the dark gray tail flashes. The letters FF were painted proudly on the stabilizer. The first fighter wing. My wing. I squinted, trying to make out the tail number. As I did, the pilot of the Raptor looked over. Even behind the dark-tinted visor of his helmet and the oxygen mask, I could feel his gaze. Slowly, deliberately, the pilot raised his left hand and pressed it against the canopy glass. Then, the Raptor did something that made the remaining breath leave my lungs. The pilot pushed his flight stick gently, dipping his left wing down, then rocking it back up to the right. A slow, pronounced wing waggle. In the civilian world, it looks like a plane just hitting a bump. In the fighter pilot community, it's a very specific, deeply historic gesture. It's a salute. A sign of profound respect, usually reserved for honoring a fallen comrade or acknowledging a hero. What is he doing? He's going to hit us, Leora cried, hyperventilating now. He's saluting, I whispered. The realization hitting me like a physical blow. Before Leora could ask what I meant, the heavy, reinforced door of the cockpit swung open. The cabin went dead silent. Passengers held their breath as the first officer stepped out into the first-class galley. He was an older man, maybe in his late 50s, with silver hair and a sharp, authoritative demeanor. He didn't look panicked. In fact, he looked incredibly solemn. He walked down the aisle of the first-class cabin. Leora immediately shot her hand up. Excuse me. Excuse me. We need to know what is going on right now. My husband is a very important man, and I demand to know. The first officer completely ignored her. He walked right past the businessman, right past my frantic sister, and stopped squarely in the aisle beside my seat. He turned to face me. He looked down at my uniform, his eyes catching the light of the silver captain's bars on my shoulders and the ribbons on my chest. Captain Jenkins? He asked, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed cabin. I looked up at him, my mind racing. Yes, sir. He snapped his heels together. In the middle of a commercial flight, 30,000 feet over the ocean, the first officer of United Flight 83 rendered a sharp, textbook military salute. Captain, he said, his voice thick with sudden emotion. Air traffic control just relayed a message from the Pentagon. The airspace has been cleared. The escort outside is here by direct order of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Leora stared at the man, her jaw hanging perfectly slack. Escort? For her? The first officer didn't even glance at my sister. He kept his eyes locked on mine. They wanted to make sure you got home safe, Captain. And the President of the United States extends his personal gratitude for your actions in the Al-Hazar Valley. The entire first-class cabin fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The only sound was the muffled, distant roar of the 2 most lethal warplanes on Earth. Flying off our wings, my personal guard of honor. You could have heard a pin drop over the drone of the Boeing 777's massive jet engines. The silence in the first-class cabin was absolute, thick, and suffocating. The first officer held his salute for a long, heavy moment before lowering his hand. He gave me a sharp, respectful nod, turned on his heel, and walked back toward the fortified cockpit door. The heavy click of the lock echoed like a gunshot. For 10 agonizing seconds, nobody moved. Then, the businessman across the aisle, the same man Leora had been trying to impress with Greg's corporate title, slowly reached up and unclipped his seatbelt. He stood up, smoothing his tie, and turned to face me. He didn't say a word. He just placed his right hand over his heart and bowed his head. A ripple effect washed through the cabin. A woman in row 4 began to clap, a slow, tentative sound that was quickly joined by the man next to her. Within moments, the entire front half of the plane erupted into a thunderous wave of applause. Passengers from the economy section, craning their necks to see what was happening, began cheering without even fully understanding why, caught up in the sheer electric emotion of the moment. I felt a hot flush creep up my neck. Fighter pilots aren't trained for applause. We operate in the dark, in the margins of the sky, far away from the public eye. My hands, which hadn't shaken when I was dodging anti-aircraft fire in the Al-Hazar Valley, suddenly felt damp with sweat. I turned my head toward the window to avoid the staring eyes. Outside, the two F-22 Raptors were still holding their formation. I stared at the jet on our left. The pilot hadn't moved his jet an inch from our wing. I knew exactly who it was. The tactical call sign, painted in tiny, faint letters just beneath the canopy, read Ghost. It was Captain David O'Connor, my wingman, the man whose life I had saved 3 days ago. He had pulled some serious strings, or the Pentagon had pulled them for him to fly this intercept. He raised 2 fingers to the edge of his visor. I pressed my palm flat against the cold acrylic of the window in silent acknowledgement. Message received. Ghost. See you on the ground. With a sudden, violent surge of raw power, both Raptors ignited their afterburners. Twin plumes of blinding blue-orange fire erupted from their exhaust nozzles. In less than a second, they pitched their noses toward the heavens and rocketed into a sheer vertical climb, tearing through the cloud layer and vanishing into the stratosphere. The sonic boom rattled the thick glass of the passenger windows, a physical shockwave that vibrated in my chest. Selene. The voice was so small, so utterly devoid of its usual arrogant bite, that I almost didn't recognize it. I turned slowly to look at my sister. Leora was pressed back into her plush leather seat, her manicured hands trembling in her lap. Her expensive silk eye mask had fallen onto the floor, discarded and forgotten. The heavy layers of makeup on her face suddenly looked like a fragile mask that had cracked right down the middle. "Celine, what did he mean?" she whispered, her eyes wide, darting from my face to the empty sky outside, and back again. "What is the Al-Hazar Valley? The president? Celine, what is going on?" I smoothed a crease in my dress blue trousers, keeping my voice low so only she could hear. "I told you, Leora. I work for the government." "You told me you did paperwork," she hissed, a desperate edge of hysteria creeping into her voice. "You told me you sat at a desk at Langley. Mom and Dad think you manage logistics for cargo planes." "Mom and Dad think what I need them to think so they can sleep at night," I replied, my tone entirely flat. "And I let you think what you want to think, because frankly, Leora, it's easier than trying to explain my reality to someone who throws a tantrum when the lounge runs out of almond milk." She flinched, as if I had physically struck her. "I don't do paperwork," I continued, leaning in just a fraction. "I pilot a $150 million machine that flies faster than the speed of sound. My desk is a cockpit. And 3 days ago, while you were picking out which designer sunglasses to pack for this trip, my team and I were pulling 12 Americans out of a valley overrun by people who wanted to put their executions on the internet." Leora's breath hitched. Tears welled up in her eyes, smudging her immaculate mascara. For the first time in my entire life, my older sister looked at me not with condescension, but with pure, unadulterated awe and fear. You were in combat?" she stammered. "You could have died?" "It was close," I admitted softly, looking down at the silver wings pinned to my chest. "I took a hit. I brought the jet back completely blind. But my men came home. That's all that matters." I didn't know," she choked out, a tear spilling over her eyelashes and cutting a track down her powdered cheek. "Celine, I'm so sorry. The things I said, about you not being special, about you being a cog. I had no idea." "You never asked, Leora," I said simply. "You never wanted to know. You were too busy making sure everyone knew how important your world was, to realize that other people might be holding it together for you in the dark." She had no counter-argument. There was no snappy comeback, no passive-aggressive pivot. She just sat there, staring at her trembling hands, the full weight of her own superficiality crushing down on her. For the rest of the flight, Leora didn't speak. She didn't order another mimosa. She didn't complain about the Wi-Fi. She just sat perfectly still, occasionally stealing glances at me as if I were a stranger who had suddenly materialized in her sister's seat. And in a way, I suppose I was. The sister she thought she knew, the quiet, unimpressive desk clerk she kept around to feel better about herself, had just been incinerated in the afterglow of 2 F-22 Raptors. The descent into Honolulu was usually my favorite part of the flight. I loved watching the emerald green of the volcanic islands rise out of the vast sapphire ocean. But today, the atmosphere in the cabin was charged with an electric tension that made the descent feel completely different. As we broke through the final layer of clouds, the familiar voice of Captain Miller came over the intercom again. "Ladies and gentlemen, as we prepare for our final approach into Honolulu, I need to make a brief announcement. We will not be taxiing to our scheduled gate at the main terminal immediately. By order of the Federal Aviation Administration and the Department of Defense, United Flight 83 has been diverted to land on the military airstrip at Joint Base Pearl Harbor, Hickam." A fresh wave of whispers broke out. Leora gripped the armrests, her knuckles turning white. "Once we have come to a complete stop," the captain continued, his voice softening just a fraction, "all passengers are required to remain in their seats. Nobody moves until our guest of honor has disembarked." The 777 touched down on the reinforced concrete of Hickam Field with a heavy, shuddering thud. The thrust reversers roared, pinning us to our seats as the massive aircraft decelerated. Instead of turning toward the crowded, chaotic civilian gates, filled with tourists in floral shirts, the plane taxied toward a sprawling, heavily guarded military apron. Through my window, I could see them waiting. Lined up on the sun-baked tarmac, standing at perfect attention, was a full Air Force honor guard. Their chrome bayonets glinted fiercely in the Hawaiian sun. Behind them stood a row of sleek, black government SUVs with dark, tinted windows. And standing at the forefront of the formation, his chest covered in a colorful block of ribbons, was Lieutenant General Thomas, the commander of the Pacific Air Forces. The engines whined down, spinning to a halt. The seatbelt sign chimed off, but true to the captain's orders, not a single passenger stood up. Not even the businessman. They all just turned their heads to look at me. Brenda, the flight attendant, approached my row. She looked incredibly nervous as she unlatched the heavy cabin door. The pressurized seal hissed, and the thick, humid air of Oahu flooded into the air-conditioned cabin, carrying the scent of salt water and aviation fuel. "Captain Jenkins?" Brenda said softly, gesturing toward the open door. "They're waiting for you, ma'am." I unbuckled my seatbelt and stood up. I reached into the overhead bin, retrieved my service cap, and placed it squarely on my head, adjusting the brim so it sat perfectly level. I picked up my duffel bag. Before I could step into the aisle, I felt a hand catch my sleeve. I looked down. Leora was looking up at me, her face pale, her eyes red-rimmed. All the perfectly curated, Instagram-ready gloss of her life had been stripped away. She looked incredibly small. "Celine," she whispered, her voice cracking. I don't know what to say. I'm so proud of you, and I am so ashamed of myself." I looked at my older sister. For years, I had craved her validation. For years, I had let her belittle my choices, quietly taking the hits, because I didn't want to break the fragile peace of our family. But looking at her now, I realized I didn't need her validation. I hadn't needed it for a very long time. The respect of the men and women I flew with, the lives I had saved in the dirt and the blood of the valley, that was all the validation I would ever need. I offered her a small, genuine smile. It wasn't a smile of superiority. It was a smile of peace. "Enjoy your vacation, Leora," I said softly. "Tell Mom and Dad I'll be at the hotel for dinner once my debrief is finished. And tell Greg I said hi." I gently pulled my sleeve from her grasp and turned away. As I walked down the aisle toward the exit, the cabin erupted once more. This time, there was no hesitation. The passengers stood up, clapping, cheering, some even wiping tears from their eyes. The first officer was standing by the cockpit door, and as I passed, he snapped off one final crisp salute. I stepped out of the aircraft and onto the metal stairs leading down to the tarmac. The blinding Pacific sun hit my face, warming my skin. Below me, the honor guard snapped to present arms in a flawless, synchronized movement. General Thomas stepped forward, a stern but incredibly proud look on his weathered face. I descended the stairs, leaving the commercial world, the luxury upgrades, and the petty judgments behind me. My boots hit the tarmac. I dropped my duffel bag, snapped my heels together, and threw a sharp, rigid salute to the general. Captain Celine Jenkins, reporting as ordered, "Sir," I barked over the distant roar of a departing cargo plane. General Thomas returned the salute, then stepped forward and extended his hand. "Welcome home, Captain. The President is waiting on the secure line. We have a lot to talk about." I shook his hand, glancing back up at the Boeing 777 one last time. In window 2A, I could see Leora's face pressed against the glass, watching me walk toward the motorcade, surrounded by the highest echelons of the United States military. She would never look at me the same way again. I wasn't just her little sister anymore. I wasn't a glorified desk clerk. I was an American fighter pilot. And I owned the sky. If this story gave you chills and made you proud of the silent heroes who guard our skies, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this incredible real-life drama with your friends and family to remind them that true courage doesn't need to brag. Subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping, emotional stories of bravery, family twists, and military honor. Drop a comment below. How would you react if you were the sister? See you next time.